In the winter of 1861, as Southern states began filing their articles of secession and the flags of a new nation were being stitched together in parlors across the Deep South, a former United States congressman and soon-to-be vice president of the Confederate States stood before a crowd in Savannah, Georgia, and said something remarkable. Not remarkable for its courage or its wisdom, but remarkable for its honesty. Alexander Stephens, the man Jefferson Davis had chosen as his second in command, told that audience directly that the new Confederacy was founded on a rejection of the most famous sentence the American Republic had ever produced. Thomas Jefferson had written that all men are created equal, and Stephens called that idea an error. He said the Confederacy's foundations were laid on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. He used the word cornerstone. He meant it as a point of pride. But before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to support the community. What Stephens gave that crowd was not a strategic manifesto or a military blueprint. It was a philosophical declaration. And it placed the Confederate project in direct opposition not just to the Union it was leaving, but to the intellectual tradition it claimed to be defending. Because the men who built this country, for all their failures and contradictions, had spent decades warning precisely about the kind of governing class that the Confederacy represented. They had written about it in their letters. They had encoded protections against it in the Constitution. They had argued about it in taverns and legislatures and pamphlets until their hands gave out. The tyranny they feared was not a distant British king. It was something closer, more intimate, and far more durable. It was the tyranny of wealth concentrated in the hands of a permanent ruling class, men whose economic interests had so thoroughly fused with their political power that the two became indistinguishable. The founders called this faction, they called it aristocracy, and they built an entire republic on the premise that it had to be stopped. The Confederate States of America was not a defense of that republic. It was the resurrection of everything the republic had been designed to prevent. The fear of aristocracy was not a minor anxiety in the founding generation. It was central, almost obsessive. When John Adams wrote about the natural aristoi, the well-born, the wealthy, the propertied, he wasn't celebrating them. He was warning that they would always seek to capture political institutions and bend them toward their private benefit. Adams believed so strongly in this danger that he argued for structural barriers to keep the wealthy class from dominating legislatures, not because he despised wealth, but because he understood what history had always shown. When a narrow economic elite gains permanent political control, the republic dies. James Madison made the same argument in Federalist No. 10, the most sophisticated piece of political writing the founding era produced. Madison's great fear was faction, a group of citizens united by a common interest that ran contrary to the rights of others and the general welfare of the whole. He knew that factions were inevitable in a free society, but he believed the Constitution's design of large republican government could neutralize their worst impulses by diluting their power across a wide and varied electorate. What Madison could not fully account for, or perhaps could not bring himself to fully confront, was the possibility that a single faction could grow so dominant in one region, so intertwined with every mechanism of local governance, every court and newspaper and church and militia, that it effectively became the government rather than just a player within it. That is precisely what happened in the antebellum South. The slaveholding planter class did not merely participate in Southern politics, they were Southern politics. By 1860, roughly 350,000 families in the entire South owned slaves. Of those, the great planters, men who owned 20 or more, numbered fewer than 50,000. And yet, this tiny fraction of the Southern population set the agenda for 11 states, dominated every major political institution from county courthouse to the United States Senate, and ultimately drove an entire region into a catastrophic war rather than allow their economic system to face the democratic pressure it deserved. This was not coincidence. It was architecture. The slaveholder class had spent generations building a political structure that insulated their power from challenge. They controlled the land, which in an agrarian economy meant they controlled employment and survival for the poor white majority. They controlled access to credit. They controlled local judiciaries. They dominated state legislatures through apportionment schemes that gave outsized representation to plantation counties and systematically underrepresented the non-slaveholding white yeomanry of the hills and mountains. They controlled what could be printed, what could be preached, and eventually what could even be said. By the 1850s, the open discussion of abolition was effectively illegal across much of the South. The Confederate Constitution also included a provision that tells you everything about the class interests driving the new government. It prohibited the Confederate Congress from enacting protective tariffs. Protective tariffs had been one of the most contentious political issues in the antebellum era precisely because Southern planters, who exported cotton and imported manufactured goods, had no use for them, while Northern industrialists and working-class laborers who competed with cheap foreign imports wanted them badly. Calhoun's nullification crisis in 1832 had been triggered specifically by a tariff dispute. By constitutionally banning protective tariffs, the Confederate founders weren't defending some abstract principle of free trade. They were encoding the economic preferences of their ruling class into the fundamental law of the land and making them immune to future democratic revision. This is what aristocracy does. This is what the founders feared. The men in Philadelphia in 1787 had debated the question of slavery with a moral seriousness that the Confederate founders explicitly rejected. Not all of them, and not consistently, but the debate happened. Gouverneur Morris called slavery a nefarious institution and the curse of heaven on the states that permitted it. Luther Martin of Maryland argued that slavery was inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution. Benjamin Franklin, in the last significant act of his public life, signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. Even Jefferson, whose ownership of over 600 enslaved people across his lifetime renders his anti-slavery rhetoric mortally compromised, wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just, because the institution of slavery was incompatible with the justice of God and the nature of free government. These were not the statements of men at peace with what they were doing. They were the statements of men who knew they were failing their own principles and who expected the nation to eventually reckon with that failure honestly. Alexander Stephens and the Confederate founders weren't interested in reckoning. They were interested in permanence. They wanted to freeze the social order of the plantation South into constitutional amber and call it civilization. Stephens' Cornerstone Speech went further than simply defending slavery as a practical necessity. It argued that slavery was a positive good, that the subjugation of black people was the natural and appropriate foundation for a society governed by and for white men of property. He was not alone in this. This was by 1861 the dominant ideological position of the Southern planter class, articulated by politicians like James Henry Hammond and clergymen like Thornton Stringfellow, and newspaper editors like J.D.B. DeBow. They had constructed an entire intellectual ecosystem designed to make the permanent subjugation of 4 million human beings feel not just acceptable, but noble. and the Confederate government they built reflected this worldview at every level. What often gets lost in popular memory of the Civil War is just how profoundly undemocratic the Confederacy was, not only toward its enslaved population, but toward its own white citizens. The Confederate government imposed the first military conscription in American history before the Union did, a draft that contained a notorious provision exempting men who owned 20 or more enslaved people from military service. This was called the Twenty Negro Law, and it generated enormous resentment among the poor white soldiers who were being sent to die for a cause that offered them this exemption from its brutal demands only if they were wealthy enough to deserve it. The phrase that circulated through the Confederate ranks was bitter and precise. It was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. That resentment was not just a morale problem. It was a recognition spreading through the Confederate Army with the velocity of a slow infection that the society they were being asked to defend was not their society. It was someone else's. The internal dissent within the Confederacy was far more substantial than the lost cause mythology has ever been willing to acknowledge. Unionist sentiment persisted throughout the war in the mountain regions of Appalachia, in East Tennessee, Western Virginia, Northern Alabama, and the hill country of Mississippi and Arkansas. These were areas where the plantation economy had never taken hold, where enslaved labor was rare, where the poor white yeomanry had always harbored a resentment of the planter class that predated the war by generations. When Virginia seceded, the mountain counties in its western regions refused to go along and eventually formed their own state, West Virginia, which was admitted to the Union in 1863. That act alone, 35 counties of a Confederate state breaking off and remaining in the Union, but is one of the most under-examined facts of the Civil War era. It tells you that secession was not a unified expression of Southern popular will. It was the will of a ruling class imposed on a fractured and coerced population. The Confederate government's response to internal dissent was not to address its legitimacy, but to suppress it. Jefferson Davis suspended habeas corpus in multiple regions of the Confederacy. The same right that Southern politicians had thundered for years was the sacred bedrock of American liberty. Secret police operations targeted known Unionists in occupied and Confederate-held territories alike. Newspapers that expressed doubts about the Confederate cause were shut down or pressured into silence. This was, again, precisely the behavior the founders had associated with arbitrary and tyrannical government. The men who gathered in Philadelphia understood that the suspension of habeas corpus, the suppression of dissenting press, and the use of state power to crush political opposition were the hallmarks of despotism. They had written extensively about this. They had built constitutional safeguards against it. And the Confederate government dismantled those safeguards almost as fast as it could set up its printing presses. There is a particular irony, almost theatrical in its precision, in the fact that the Confederate States justified secession on the grounds of states' rights, and yet built a central government that routinely overrode the rights of its member states when those states resisted Confederate policy. Georgia's governor, Joseph Brown, and Vice President Stevens himself spent significant portions of the war in open conflict with Jefferson Davis over what they saw as Confederate centralism trampling on Georgia's constitutional prerogatives. This was not a contradiction unique to the Civil War era. It is the universal behavior of ruling class ideologies, which invoke liberty as a weapon against external threats to their power, and discard it as a nuisance when it threatens internal control. States' rights, in the Confederate framework, meant the right of Southern states to maintain slavery without federal interference. It did not mean the right of individual citizens within those states to speak freely, organize politically, or refuse military service. The liberty being defended was always the liberty of the master class. James Madison's Federalist No. 51, which laid out the theory of checks and balances, rested on a simple and devastating insight about human nature: that men are not angels, that any person or group given unchecked power will eventually abuse it. The entire architecture of the Constitution, the separation of powers, the bicameral legislature, the independent judiciary, the federal structure, was designed to ensure that no single faction could accumulate enough power to tyrannize the rest. Madison understood that the most dangerous faction would not announce itself as such. It would come wrapped in the language of liberty and constitutional principle. It would dress itself in the garments of virtue, and it would use every institutional tool available to entrench its own dominance while claiming to protect everyone's freedom. The slaveholder class did this with extraordinary skill across the antebellum decades. They didn't say they wanted to protect their economic interests. They said they were protecting the Constitution. They didn't say they wanted to maintain the power of a propertied minority. They said they were defending liberty against federal tyranny. They didn't say they were afraid of democracy. They said they were afraid of consolidation, of centralism, of an overreaching government that would destroy the sovereignty of the states. Every one of these arguments was real in the sense that people believed them sincerely. But every one of them was also downstream of the fundamental interest they could not say plainly, which was that 4 million enslaved people represented several $billion in property value, that this property underpinned the entire Southern financial system, and that any political movement that threatened this property was an existential threat to the ruling class regardless of what constitutional principles it invoked. The Three-Fifths Compromise, one of the founding era's most contentious and consequential bargains, had given the slave states a structural advantage in Congress and the Electoral College that persisted for decades. Slaveholders were counted in the census, meaning their human property inflated their master's political representation. This meant that a planter in South Carolina who owned 100 enslaved people effectively cast more political weight in national elections than a free farmer in Ohio. The founders who accepted this arrangement knew it was indefensible in principle and accepted it anyway as the price of union. But they did not intend it as a permanent fixture of American political life. They intended the union they were forming to be a dynamic and evolving republic, capable of reforming itself as the moral and practical understanding of its citizens developed. What they could not fully anticipate was that the faction benefiting from this structural advantage would use that very advantage to prevent exactly the kind of reform they had imagined. By the 1850s, the slaveholder faction's grip on federal policy had produced outcomes that alarmed even moderate Northerners who had no particular sympathy for abolitionism. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 didn't just require Southern states to return escaped enslaved people. It required Northern states to actively participate in the process, conscripting Northern citizens into the machinery of slavery whether they wanted any part of it or not. Northern judges who refused to enforce it faced federal sanctions. Ordinary Northern citizens who helped freedom seekers escape faced criminal prosecution. This was the slave power operating at full extension, using its control of federal institutions to impose its interests not just on the South, but on the entire nation. It was the precise dynamic Madison had feared, a faction so powerful that it could bend the machinery of the whole republic to serve its own purposes. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed the question of slavery to be decided by popular sovereignty in new territories, was similarly a product of slaveholder political pressure. It was presented as a compromise, as a democratic measure that let the people decide. What it actually did was reopen the settled question of slavery's geographic expansion in a way that served the planter class's long-term interests and devastated the political coalition that had kept that question settled. The violence that erupted in Kansas, the guerrilla war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers that gave the territory the name Bleeding Kansas, was not a failure of the popular sovereignty principle. It was its predictable result when one faction was willing to use organized violence to achieve what it could not win through fair democratic competition. Preston Brooks, walking onto the floor of the United States Senate in 1856 and beating Charles Sumner unconscious with a metal-tipped gutta percha cane, is one of the most viscerally clarifying moments of the antebellum period. Sumner had delivered a speech mocking the physical and intellectual limitations of a South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler, who was Brooks's cousin. Brooks's response, not a duel, not a rebuttal, but a sustained physical assault on the floor of the most deliberative body in the Republic, was received across the South with celebration. Souvenir canes were sold in his honor. Southern newspapers called him a hero. South Carolina re-elected him unanimously after he briefly resigned in a gesture of theatrical honor. Northern reaction was horror, but the horrified Northern reaction is almost beside the point. What matters is what the Southern celebration tells you about the political culture the planter class had built. In that culture, physical dominance was a legitimate substitute for argument. The right of a powerful man to silence a less powerful one through violence was not just tolerated, it was admired. This was the culture of the plantation translated into legislative chambers. It was the culture of a class that had never been required to accept the verdict of a fair contest. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in November 1860, without a single Southern electoral vote, without carrying a single Southern state, South Carolina called a secession convention before he had even been inaugurated. The stated grievance was the threat Lincoln posed to Southern institutions. But Lincoln had been explicit throughout the campaign. He had no intention of abolishing slavery where it existed. He opposed its expansion into new territories. That was the position, opposition to expansion, not abolition, that drove secession. What the slaveholder class could not tolerate was not that Lincoln would destroy slavery. It was that his election represented the possibility that a national political majority could, over time, develop the will to do so. They could not tolerate the democratic principle operating freely in a nation where that principle might eventually be turned against them. This is the argument that Madison had made in reverse. Madison had argued that the diversity of a large republic would prevent any single faction from achieving permanent dominance. What the secession crisis of 1860 demonstrated was that a faction with enough concentrated economic power, enough control over regional institutions, and enough willingness to use violence could resist the logic of Madison's republic almost indefinitely, and when it finally could not, would choose destruction over democratic accountability. Jefferson Davis, in his farewell address to the United States Senate in January 1861, a speech of considerable rhetorical craft, framed secession as a constitutional act, a reserved right of sovereign states that the federal compact could not legitimately override. He was calm, dignified, and entirely self-convinced. He presented himself and the cause he was about to lead as defenders of the original constitutional settlement, standing against federal overreach and Northern aggression. He invoked the Declaration of Independence, the consent of the governed, the right of free peoples to determine their own destiny. It was a performance of constitutional principle delivered in defense of a system that denied constitutional personhood to 4 million people. The founders had written about this too, about the way that the language of liberty could be weaponized by men who had no intention of extending it beyond themselves. Patrick Henry, who opposed ratification of the Constitution in part because he feared it gave the federal government too much power, also opposed slavery with a frankness that many of his contemporaries lacked. He called it a national blot and expressed shame at his own participation in it. George Mason, who drafted the Virginia Declaration of Rights and is often cited by states' rights advocates as a founding authority, said that slavery produced the most pernicious effect on manners, and that every master was born a petty tyrant. He had seen in his own society what unchecked dominance over other human beings did to the men who held that dominance, how it corrupted their character, how it made them unfit for the self-restraint that Republican government demanded. Mason was talking about a moral consequence, but he was also describing a political one. A class of men accustomed to absolute authority over the human beings they owned was not a class of men well suited to accept the authority of a democratic majority. The habits of the plantation did not stay on the plantation. The Confederate military command structure reflected the class structure of the society that produced it. The officer corps was dominated by the sons of planters, West Point graduates with family connections and social standing, who had been groomed from birth to lead and to expect deference. The enlisted ranks were filled disproportionately with poor white men who had little stake in the slave economy, and who, as the war ground on and the exemptions and substitution system became more nakedly class stratified, came to understand with increasing bitterness that the war's burdens and benefits were not equitably distributed. Desertion rates in the Confederate Army grew steadily across the war's final years, reaching levels that genuinely threatened military cohesion. This was not primarily cowardice. It was men voting with their feet on the question of who this war was actually for. The lost cause mythology that calcified around Confederate memory in the decades after the war performed a remarkable act of historical ventriloquism. It took the Confederacy's actual cause, the explicit, documented, repeatedly stated cause of preserving and expanding racial slavery, and replaced it with a nobler-sounding narrative about constitutional principle, Southern honor, and resistance to federal tyranny. Robert E. Lee became a marble saint, a man of duty and sadness who had opposed slavery personally but could not abandon his state. Jefferson Davis became a statesman who had pursued the constitutional rights of his people by legitimate means. The Confederate battle flag became a symbol of Southern heritage rather than the banner under which men fought to keep 4 million people in permanent bondage. Statues went up across the South, not primarily in the immediate post-war years, but during the Jim Crow era and again during the Civil Rights Movement, their timing a direct signal of their actual intent, which was not commemoration, but intimidation. This mythology mattered because it did what the founders had always feared mythology would do. It replaced honest historical reckoning with flattering narrative, and it allowed the political and social structures of the slaveholder class to persist in modified form long after the institution that had created them was formally abolished. The black codes that Southern states enacted almost immediately after the war's end, the convict leasing systems that effectively recreated forced labor under the cover of criminal justice, the sharecropping arrangements that trapped formerly enslaved people in debt peonage on the same land they had worked without wages, These were not random cruelties. They were the slaveholder class reconstituting its economic system with whatever legal tools it had available. And the political machinery that enabled them, the disenfranchisement campaigns, the literacy tests, the grandfather clauses, the terror of the Ku Klux Klan, was the same machinery the planter class had always used. The subordination of democratic principle to ruling class interest, enforced by the threat of violence. Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1820, in one of the most famous letters of his later life, that the Missouri Compromise controversy, the debate over whether Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, had awoken him like a fire bell in the night. He was 77 years old, and he could see where it was going. He wrote that he considered the question at once as the knell of the Union. He knew that slavery was the wound that would eventually prove fatal. And he knew somewhere in the part of his mind that he spent his life trying to suppress, that the republic he had helped build was living on borrowed time, that the contradiction between its founding principles and its founding practices could not be papered over forever. What Jefferson could not bring himself to do, and what the Confederate founders celebrated as a virtue, was face that contradiction honestly. The Confederate project was, at its core, a bet that the contradiction could be resolved not by eliminating slavery, but by eliminating the principle of equality. If you rip Jefferson's self-evident truth out of the American creed and replaced it with Stephen's cornerstone, if you built a society explicitly and permanently on the premise of racial hierarchy, then the contradiction disappeared. You no longer had to reconcile freedom with slavery because you no longer claimed that freedom was universal. This was the Confederate solution, and it was, in the deepest sense, an answer to everything the founders had built and everything they had warned was most worth protecting. Madison's nightmare was a faction so powerful that it could unmake the Republic. The Confederate planter class came remarkably close. They captured the federal government for decades through their Senate leverage and their control of the Democratic Party. They pushed the country into a series of crises: the nullification crisis, the gag rule, the annexation of Texas, the Kansas-Nebraska disaster, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, each one a little worse than the last, each one a product of a ruling class refusing to accept that, in a democratic republic, other people's interests count too. When they finally could not get what they wanted through constitutional means, they left and tried to build something that could not be democratically challenged, a republic frozen at 1861, with slavery eternal and the planter class permanent. They failed. 4 years and over 600,000 dead later, the experiment in Confederate aristocracy was finished. But the failure on the battlefield was not the same as a resolution of the underlying question. The founders had understood that a republic was not a thing you built once and kept. It was a thing you maintained actively against the constant pressure of faction and concentrated power. It required citizens willing to defend its principles not just with arms but with honesty, honest about history, honest about who had power and why, honest about the distance between the nation's ideals and its practices. The men who built the Confederacy were not misguided patriots fighting for a constitutional principle that happened to have an unfortunate connection to slavery. They were the thing the constitutional principle had been designed to stop. They were the faction. They were the aristocracy. They were the cunning and ambitious and unprincipled men that Washington had named in his farewell address as the greatest threat to Republican government. They knew the language of the Republic well enough to use it, but they had never accepted its substance. Liberty in their hands had always been a word that applied to them and not to others. a weapon aimed outward at the government they wanted to resist, never a mirror turned inward at the government they had built. What makes this history so persistently relevant is not that the Confederacy itself poses any ongoing threat. It doesn't. It was defeated. It is gone. What makes it relevant is the pattern it represents. The pattern of a powerful minority using the language of constitutional liberty to insulate its privileges from democratic accountability. The pattern of faction clothing itself in the robes of principle. The pattern of men who have captured institutions claiming that any challenge to their dominance is an attack on freedom itself. The founders knew this pattern intimately. They had watched it operate in the parliamentary corruption of Georgian England, in the aristocratic capture of continental European governments, in the ancient republics of Greece and Rome that they had studied obsessively and mourned as cautionary tales. They had encoded their fear of it into every structural feature of the Constitution. The Confederate States of America, in its brief and catastrophic 4 years of existence, proved that their fear had been well-founded. It also proved that the safeguards they had built were imperfect, that a faction determined enough, resourceful enough, and willing to use violence could do enormous damage before the Republic's self-correcting mechanisms could operate. The Civil War cost more American lives than any other conflict in the nation's history. The Reconstruction that followed was incomplete, contested, and eventually abandoned, leaving the formerly enslaved population to face a century of systematic terror and exclusion that the founders' framework should have prevented, but didn't. None of this means the founding generation's principles were wrong. It means they were harder to sustain than the founders had hoped, and that sustaining them requires something the founders ultimately trusted in, but could not guarantee. A citizenry willing to see clearly, willing to call faction by its name even when it speaks fluently in the language of liberty. Willing to recognize that the man who claims to be defending constitutional freedom while denying it to others is not defending constitutional freedom at all. Willing to read the Cornerstone Speech and understand that the civilization Stevens was so proud of was exactly the civilization Madison had spent his life trying to prevent. The fire bell that woke Jefferson in the night in 1820 was answered eventually at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. But fire bells have a way of ringing again. The question the founders left for every generation that followed them was not whether the Republic could survive one aristocracy's attempt to make itself permanent. They answered that question in blood and over 4 years of grinding war. The question they left was whether the Republic could stay clear-eyed enough about its own history to recognize the next one before it had already built its cornerstone